just because you leave prison doesn't mean that prison leaves you. What I mean by this is that the wounds that you endure while you're incarcerated, they may heal, but they leave scars, and this is especially true of psychological wounds. Plenty of people parole from prison with hypervigilance. They're always checking out their surroundings, watching their back, making sure nobody's sneaking up on them. It seems like after so many years of having to watch their backs that they'd want to just relax and enjoy life, but after so many years of surviving because you're not going to let that guy with a piece sneak up behind you, it's hard to believe he's not still there, there's not somebody still coming for you. Another common trait that inmates have whenever they parole is obsessive-compulsive disorder, scrubbing and cleaning surfaces that most people don't give a second thought to. It's almost a cliche that whenever an inmate paroles after a lengthy stretch, they go home and start scrubbing their toilet every single day, and this seems like an absurd practice to anybody who hasn't done an amount of time. I'm going to talk about the living conditions in San Quentin so that I can try and explain the filth that some inmates come in contact with on a day-to-day basis and express how it can result in OCD and a compulsive need to try to control your environment through cleanliness. I remember arriving at San Quentin, and my first memory of walking into Badger Section, the building I would be housed, is the stink. It hit you like a wall of stench whenever you walked into the building. It didn't make any sense. As I was walking down the tier, it was freshly mopped. You could smell the cleaning fluid, the detergent, under the smell of rotting something. And every cell that I walked past was immaculately clean, perfectly folded sheets. Some guys were even actively scrubbing floors or walls as I walked past, but the stink was indescribable. Since I've been home, I was able to look up what it is that makes that building smell so bad. It turns out that there was a lawsuit, Toussaint versus McCarthy, 1985. I want to quote from that lawsuit in order to explain exactly how bad this smell was. And as I read this, I want you to bear in mind that, one, this building was built in 1910 and it hadn't been cleaned in some of these areas in that entire time. And two, these facts are not things CDC contested. They agreed that the things that I'm reading are true. It was agreed upon by both parties. Toussaint v. McCarthy. An environmental expert identified in the bottom of more than one pipe chase waste material from a sewer cleanout, including human feces and rotting garbage. The filth in these service areas adds to the general stench in the immediately adjacent cell area. It provides an ideal medium in which the cockroaches and rats that infest the prison spawn and thrive. They're describing the maintenance shaft that's behind every cell that inmates don't have access to. I hadn't realized at the time, but apparently there has been rotting garbage and human waste for the past 90 years building up in these areas. No wonder it stunk. Whenever you're locked in a little cell, just all day, day in and day out, you look for any way to control the environment. Maybe that little smudge on the floor is the reason everything smells so bad. I know that it's not true, but by cleaning that little area that you can control, you gain a feeling of control over the river of human waste that's behind your cell that you have to smell all day long. Just to further elaborate on this, I want to point out that in the same court case, it was acknowledged by CDC that there was no airflow in these buildings, that they were stagnant, and that inmates rarely left their cells, which were very small. Let's read another little quote from Toussaint v. McCarthy about how small and confined these cells were. The cells used to house the segregated inmates in all of these units are basically similar. All are between 5 and 6 feet in width and between 8 and 10 feet in length. Later it reads, plaintiffs are restricted to their cells at all times. Plaintiffs are thus required to perform all functions of eating, sleeping, and elimination within the cells. Not uncommonly, a segregated inmate may languish 5 or more consecutive days locked inside his cell, never setting foot outside of his cell. Just to drive home how small of an area we're talking about, I want to express I sleep on a California king bed. I love my California king bed. It was a gift to my wife and I from a good friend, and since I've paroled, it's probably my favorite thing. The dimensions of a California king bed are 7 feet by 8 feet. It's about the size of one of these segregated cells we're talking about, where you're locked in it for 5 days or more at a time with another person. One other aspect of that memory stands out, of walking down the tier, just experiencing that stench. Some smells you smell with your nose. This was a stench you experienced with everything you had. But as I was walking down the tier, I noticed that pretty much every single cell had something covering their toilet. A folded up jacket with some boots on top of it, or maybe a plastic bag tied at the bottom. I didn't give it a lot of thought, but I made a mental note to ask somebody. I went to my cell all the way at the end of the tier and closed the door and just kind of accepted that's where I was going to spend the next chunk of my life. There are inmates that are allowed to walk up and down the tier, porters. And eventually one of them came by my cell to ask how I was doing, introduce himself. And he stopped and looked in and said, "Hey, new guy, you gotta cover up your toilet, man. Are you crazy?" I said, "Why do I have to cover up my toilet?" It seemed like a strange practice. And he explained to me that if you don't cover up your toilet, unless it's in use, there are rats that live in the chase behind the cells that will swim through the pipes and come up out of your toilet. They'll steal your food, or perhaps even attack you when you're asleep. I never saw one of these toilet rats, but apparently they were a real problem, and some inmates had even been bit and gotten something called rat bite fever, which is potentially fatal. It's a serious illness. Needless to say, I wasn't going to argue with him on the point. I started covering up my toilet that day, and I think just about everybody there at San Quentin did. To be clear, the rats they have there, they're not cute little pet store rats. They're something called Norway rats. And they're big, and they're mean, and they're aggressive. Between the rats, the stink, and the incredibly confined quarters, many inmates are emotionally, psychologically scarred whenever they finally do parole from prison. They have to spend years of their lives trying to adjust to a new environment and overcome the hardships they endured. Many other inmates simply don't. They accept that they are always going to be the way they are on the day that they paroled. They don't attempt to overcome their hardships. That's the true tragedy. The day that you stop fighting to overcome a hardship is the day that it stops being something that happened to you and starts being who you are. So take a moment. Consider what it is that haunts you in your life and resolve that you can overcome it and that you will do the work to do so.